In 1850, Britain wasn't just a manufacturing powerhouse. They were the only manufacturing powerhouse. They produced more than half of the world's iron, more than half of the world's coal, nearly half of all manufactured goods on Earth. British factories didn't just lead the world. They were the world. British steam engines powered global industry. British textiles clothed continents. British steel built the railways that connected nations. British ships dominated every ocean. When other countries wanted to industrialize, they bought British machines, hired British engineers, studied British methods. Britain didn't just win the Industrial Revolution, they invented it. And for 100 years, no one could touch them. By 1950, Britain couldn't make steel at competitive prices. Their textile mills sat empty. Their shipyards fell silent. The factories that once employed millions became graveyards of rusted equipment and shattered windows. And Britain, the nation that taught the world how to manufacture, became a net importer of manufactured goods from Germany, Japan, and America. 1 century, from producing half the world's industrial output to buying everything from countries that learned by copying them. The workshop of the world became a post-industrial shell running on finance, services, and memories of former glory. And they never recovered. Not in 75 years. Because once you lose your manufacturing base, you don't get it back. Not in a generation. Not in a lifetime. Maybe not ever. Right now, in 2025, the United States is 170 years behind Britain on the exact same timeline. Factory closures accelerating. Market share evaporating. Importing from competitors we once dominated. And we're in stage 4 of the same 5-stage collapse pattern that destroyed Britain's industrial empire forever. Stage 5 is total deindustrialization, economic dependency, permanent decline. And we're 1 stage away. But Britain wasn't the only warning. In 1950, Detroit was the richest city in America, the automotive capital of the world, the symbol of American industrial might. By 2013, Detroit was bankrupt, a hollowed-out shell with 80,000 abandoned buildings and a population that fled in terror. Before we walk through the pattern, you need to understand what manufacturing actually means for national power, not in abstract economic theory, in brutal practical reality. Manufacturing isn't just about making things. It's about capability. It's about resilience. It's about independence. It's about security. It's about leverage. When you manufacture, you don't just employ factory workers. You employ the engineers who innovate, the technicians who problem solve, the supply chain workers who move materials, the designers who create, the logistics experts who coordinate, the quality control specialists who refine. 1 factory job creates 5 supporting jobs: tool and die makers, steel suppliers, parts manufacturers, transport companies, machine maintenance, engineering firms. When manufacturing thrives, entire ecosystems thrive. The middle class thrives because factory jobs pay well without requiring college degrees. You graduate high school, you get hired, you learn on the job. You earn $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 with benefits and a pension. You buy a house, you raise a family, you build generational wealth. That was the American dream, built in factories, sustained by paychecks from making things. But when manufacturing dies, everything dies with it. The jobs vanish, the skills disappear, the supply chains relocate overseas. The knowledge base evaporates, and you can't get it back. Because once factories close, once the experienced workers retire or die, Once the machinery is sold for scrap, once the supply networks move to other continents, rebuilding takes decades, if it's possible at all. And historically, it never is. Every nation that has lost its manufacturing base has remained dependent on other nations forever. Dependent for goods, dependent for technology, dependent for components, dependent for security. Manufacturing is sovereignty. Losing it is national suicide in slow motion. Let's examine how it happened 3 times before and why it's happening again right now. Let's return to 1850. Britain at the peak of industrial dominance. The first nation to industrialize. The only nation with mature industrial capacity. They produced over 50% of the world's iron ore, over 50% of global coal, over 40% of all manufactured products. British textile mills clothed 4 continents. British steel mills built railways across empires. British shipyards constructed the vessels that carried global trade. British engineers were hired by foreign governments to build their infrastructure. This is stage 1. Absolute manufacturing dominance, unmatched technological leadership, unchallenged production capacity. Britain had every conceivable advantage. They invented the steam engine, the power loom, the Bessemer steel process, railways, telegraph, precision machinery, all British innovations. They had abundant coal deposits, easy access to iron ore, capital to invest from centuries of trade, a skilled workforce trained through rigorous apprenticeships, and they had the British Empire providing captive markets and raw materials. Britain was so dominant, they practiced free trade. Why impose tariffs when your factories outproduce everyone else combined? Why protect industries when no one can compete with your efficiency, quality, and scale? But dominance breeds complacency, and success attracts imitators. Stage 2. Competitors emerge. Study your methods, copy your technology, then improve on everything. In the mid-1800s, Germany and the United States started serious industrialization. They didn't try to invent everything from scratch. They studied Britain. They bought British machinery and reverse-engineered it. They hired British engineers and extracted their knowledge. They sent students to observe British factories and documented every process. Then they improved on all of it. Germany invested heavily in technical education. They created engineering universities that produced graduates with theoretical knowledge British apprentices lacked. German companies like Krupp and Siemens innovated in steel production, chemical engineering, and electrical systems. They built newer factories with more efficient layouts. They adopted better management practices. By 1900, Germany was producing more steel than Britain. Not because they invented steel, because they made it better and cheaper. The United States had natural advantages Britain couldn't match. Vast territory, abundant natural resources, oil, a massive domestic market. And American entrepreneurs like Carnegie and Rockefeller built industrial empires using the latest technology, while British firms stuck with outdated equipment and old methods. By 1900, the United States was producing more steel than Britain and Germany combined. This is stage 3. Market share collapses. Competition intensifies. Britain's share of global manufacturing fell from 40% in 1850 to 14% by 1913. They were still manufacturing, but they were no longer dominant. And their response wasn't to innovate. It was to cut costs. British companies stopped investing in new equipment. They stopped training workers in new techniques. They relied on their reputation while competitors built superior products at lower prices. Stage 4. Factory closures accelerate. Jobs vanish. The decades after World War I were catastrophic for British industry. The war had devastated European economies, but it also forced other nations to develop their own manufacturing capacity. Countries that previously bought British goods built their own factories during the war. And after the war, they didn't return to British suppliers. British textile mills started closing in the 1920s. They couldn't compete with cheaper textiles from India, Japan, and America. British coal mines started closing as oil replaced coal for energy. British shipyards started closing as other nations built ships domestically. British steel mills started closing as American and German steel became cheaper and higher quality. By the 1930s, British industrial unemployment exceeded 20%. Entire industrial cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham saw mass unemployment. Factory workers who'd earned good wages for generations found themselves with no jobs and no prospects. World War II provided temporary industrial revival. Britain ramped up weapons production. But after the war, the decline accelerated. By 1950, Stage 5 was complete. Total deindustrialization. Economic dependency. Britain couldn't produce steel at globally competitive prices. They imported steel from Germany and America. They couldn't manufacture textiles competitively. They imported clothing from Asia. They couldn't build ships economically. They imported or bought ships from Japan and South Korea. They couldn't produce cars that people wanted. British Leyland collapsed in the 1970s, and Britain started importing cars from Germany, Japan, and America. Today, Britain imports almost everything. They import 80% of their manufactured goods. They closed their last deep coal mine in 2015. They produce less steel than they did in 1850, despite having 200 years of technological progress. They've lost entire industries completely. The lesson of Britain. Once you lose manufacturing dominance, you never recover. Technology moves forward. Competitors surpass you. And being first means absolutely nothing when others do it better and cheaper. But maybe Britain was a special case, an aging empire stretched too thin. Maybe a concentrated industrial base in a single powerful nation could hold on. Detroit proved that theory catastrophically wrong. Let's move to 1950. Detroit, Michigan, the Motor City. In 1950, Detroit was the wealthiest city in America per capita. It was the undisputed center of the global automotive industry. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, the Big Three, all headquartered in Detroit. Between them, they directly employed over 250,000 workers in Detroit alone, and hundreds of thousands more worked in supporting industries, parts suppliers, tool and die shops, steel plants, rubber factories, glass manufacturers, paint suppliers, machine shops. The entire automotive supply chain radiated from Detroit. This is Stage 1. Manufacturing dominance, single industry specialization. If you lived in Detroit, you worked in automotive or for someone who did. And the compensation was extraordinary. UAW union jobs paid $25 to $30 per hour in today's inflation-adjusted dollars, plus full benefits, health insurance, pensions, job security. A high school graduate could get hired at a GM plant, work 30 years, and retire with a full pension and health care for life. You could support a family of 4 on a single factory income, buy a house, own 2 cars, take vacations, send your kids to college. This was the American dream fully realized. Detroit's population hit 1.85 million in 1950, the highest per capita income of any major American city. The city built massive highway systems. Suburbs expanded rapidly. Downtown had world-class theaters, department stores, and restaurants. The tax base was so strong, the city could afford excellent schools, parks, and public services. Detroit was booming. But dominance creates complacency, and complacency invites disaster. Stage 2. Competitors emerge. Study your model. Improve everything. In the 1960s and 1970s, Japanese automakers entered the American market. Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Mazda. At first, American automakers and consumers dismissed them completely. Tiny cars, cheap cars, low quality, unreliable. Who would buy a Japanese car when you could buy an American muscle car? But the Japanese weren't static. They studied American manufacturing obsessively. They identified every inefficiency, every waste, every flaw. And they innovated. They invented lean manufacturing, just-in-time inventory that eliminated waste. Kaizen, continuous improvement built into company culture. Quality circles that empowered workers to identify and solve problems. And they built better cars, more reliable, more fuel efficient, cheaper to maintain, better quality control. When the 1973 oil crisis hit and gasoline prices quadrupled overnight, American muscle cars with 10-mile-per-gallon fuel economy became undesirable. Consumers wanted fuel efficiency, and Japanese cars delivered. The Big Three kept building the same cars they'd always built. Large, heavy, inefficient, unreliable. They assumed American consumers would always buy American out of patriotism or habit. They were catastrophically wrong. Stage 3. Market share collapses. Offshoring begins. By 1980, Japanese automakers controlled 20% of the American market. By 1990, 30%. The Big Three hemorrhaged market share every year, and their response wasn't innovation, it was cost-cutting. They closed factories in Detroit and moved production to locations with cheaper labor. Tennessee, Alabama, Mexico, anywhere wages were lower. Detroit's automotive employment fell from 250,000 in 1950 to 150,000 by 1980, then to 100,000 by 1990, then 50,000 by 2000. The factories didn't just shrink. They closed permanently. Packard Plant closed in 1958. Dodge Main closed in 1980. Fisher Body Plant, 21, closed in 1984. One by one, the massive factories that defined Detroit shut down. The equipment was sold. The buildings were abandoned. Stage 4. Factory closures accelerate. Jobs vanish. Communities collapse. The 2000s were apocalyptic for Detroit. The 2008 financial crisis nearly destroyed General Motors and Chrysler. Both companies went bankrupt. The federal government bailed them out with tens of billions of taxpayer dollars. But the Detroit factories didn't reopen. GM and Chrysler emerged from bankruptcy leaner, which meant fewer workers and fewer facilities. Most of their production had already moved out of Detroit. The bailout saved the companies, but not the city. Ford survived without a bailout, but they closed Detroit plants too. By 2010, Detroit's automotive employment had fallen to 30,000, a 90% decline from the peak, and those jobs weren't replaced with equivalent employment. A factory worker earning $60,000 per year loses their job. Maybe they find retail work paying $25,000. Maybe they find nothing. The tax base collapsed. Detroit couldn't afford basic services. Streetlights went dark. Police response times hit 58 minutes. Fire stations closed. Schools closed. The population fled. Detroit's population fell from 1.85 million in 1950 to 700,000 by 2013. A 60% population loss. Those who could leave did. Those who couldn't stay behind in a city that couldn't provide basic services. Over 80,000 buildings were abandoned. Entire neighborhoods became urban prairies. Houses that once sold for $100,000 sold for $1,000 or were simply abandoned. In 2013, Detroit declared bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Stage 5 complete. Total deindustrialization. Economic collapse. Permanent decline. But maybe Detroit was too specialized, too dependent on a single industry. Surely a more diversified industrial region could survive. The American Rust Belt proved that wrong too. Let's examine the Rust Belt, 1970 to 2020. The Rust Belt is America's industrial heartland. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin. In 1970, this region was the manufacturing core of the United States. Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the world. Cleveland produced steel and heavy machinery. Youngstown was built on steel mills. Gary, Indiana, was steel. Akron was rubber and tire manufacturing. Buffalo was diversified manufacturing. Flint was automotive. Each city dominated specific industries. Stage 1. Manufacturing dominance across multiple sectors. In 1970, the United States produced 20% of the world's steel. U.S. Steel alone employed 300,000 workers. Bethlehem Steel employed 165,000. Republic Steel, LTV Steel, Inland Steel, dozens of major steel companies, millions of workers employed directly in steel mills and supporting industries. These were exceptional jobs, union jobs paying $30 to $40 per hour in inflation-adjusted dollars. Full benefits, pensions, job security. You could graduate high school, get hired at the mill, work 30 years, and retire with a full pension and health care. Towns were built entirely around the mills. Youngstown, Ohio, had a population of 170,000 in 1970, almost entirely dependent on steel. But the rest of the world was industrializing using modern technology. Stage 2. Competitors emerge with superior technology and lower costs. In the 1970s, Germany, Japan, and South Korea built brand new steel mills using the latest technology: electric arc furnaces, continuous casting, computer-controlled processes. Far more efficient than the old American blast furnaces built in the 1920s and 1930s. And they had dramatically lower labor costs. American steelworkers earned $25 per hour. South Korean steelworkers earned $3 per hour. The math was brutal. By 1980, American steel was uncompetitive on price. It was cheaper to import foreign steel than produce it domestically. And American steel companies, instead of modernizing their facilities and processes, lobbied Congress for protective tariffs and cut costs anywhere they could. Stage 3. Market share collapses. Offshoring accelerates. Through the 1980s and 1990s, American steel plants closed at an accelerating rate. First, the least efficient plants, then older integrated mills, then entire companies. U.S. Steel cut employment from 300,000 to 50,000. Bethlehem Steel went bankrupt in 2001. LTV Steel bankrupt in 2000. Republic Steel dismantled. Entire corporations that once employed hundreds of thousands simply ceased to exist. And it wasn't just steel. Manufacturing across every sector in the Rust Belt collapsed simultaneously. Textiles moved to China and Southeast Asia. Electronics manufacturing moved to Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. Machinery production moved to Germany and China. Consumer goods manufacturing moved to Mexico and China. NAFTA in 1994 turbocharged the offshoring. Companies could now move factories to Mexico, pay workers $2 per hour instead of 25, and import the finished goods back to the US completely tariff-free. Thousands of factories relocated. Stage 4. Factory closures accelerate. Jobs vanish. Communities die. The 2000s delivered the final blow. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Chinese manufacturing exploded. By 2010, China produced more steel than the entire rest of the world combined. They manufactured everything: textiles, electronics, machinery, tools, furniture, appliances, at prices American factories couldn't remotely match. The Rust Belt hemorrhaged jobs. Manufacturing employment fell from 19 million in 1980 to 11 million by 2010. 8 million jobs gone in 30 years. And critically, these jobs weren't replaced with equivalent employment. A factory worker making $60,000 per year with benefits loses their job. They end up in retail making $28,000 with no benefits. If they're lucky, many find nothing. The cities died. Youngstown's population fell from 170,000 to 60,000. The massive steel mills were demolished or abandoned. Gary, Indiana, fell from 175,000 to 69,000. Entire city blocks abandoned to decay. Flint, Michigan. The auto industry collapsed. Population fell 50%. Water infrastructure failed, leading to the Flint water crisis. Akron. The rubber industry vanished. Buffalo. Manufacturing gone. These cities became symbols of industrial death. Unemployment, poverty, despair, drug epidemics. The opioid crisis hit the Rust Belt harder than anywhere else because people with no jobs, no hope, and no future turned to drugs for escape. Factories that once employed 10,000 workers became empty ruins or were demolished entirely, leaving vast tracts of vacant, contaminated land. The lesson of the Rust Belt: when manufacturing leaves, it takes entire communities with it. The jobs never return. The tax base never recovers. The decay becomes permanent. 3 examples: Britain, Detroit, the Rust Belt, all followed the identical 5-stage pattern. And now the entire United States is following it. Let's break down the pattern because it repeats with mechanical precision. Stage 1. Manufacturing dominance. Technological leadership. Britain in 1850. Detroit in 1950. The Rust Belt in 1970. America overall from 1945 to 1970. In every case, they were the best, most efficient, most advanced, most productive, unchallenged. And that success bred complacency. We're too dominant to fail. Our lead is insurmountable. Competition is impossible. Stage 2. Competitors emerge. Study your methods. Copy your technology. Improve everything. Germany and America studied Britain. Japan studied Detroit. China studied the Rust Belt. Every time, the competitors took what worked, eliminated what didn't, added modern technology and lower labor costs. And every time, the dominant power dismissed them. They'll never match our quality. They can't catch up. They're decades behind. Wrong. Every single time. Stage 3. Market share collapses. Offshoring begins. Britain lost market share to Germany and America by 1900. Detroit lost market share to Japan by 1980. The Rust Belt lost market share to China by 2000. America overall is losing market share to China right now, and the response is never innovation. It's always cost-cutting. Instead of investing in new technology, companies offshore production to cheaper locations. This accelerates decline instead of stopping it. Stage 4. Factory closures accelerate. Jobs vanish. Communities collapse. Britain in the 1920s through 1950s, Detroit in the 1980s through 2000s, the Rust Belt from 1980 to 2020. America overall right now. When factories close, they don't reopen. Workers don't find equivalent jobs. Communities built around manufacturing spiral into poverty and decay. Since 2000, America has lost 5 million manufacturing jobs. Factories have closed in every state. We now run a trade deficit of $800 billion per year. We import $800 billion more than we export annually. Stage 5. Complete deindustrialization. Total economic dependency. Permanent decline. Britain reached stage 5 by 1950. They import almost everything and haven't rebuilt industrial capacity in 75 years. Detroit reached stage 5 by 2013. The automotive industry is gone from the city. The Rust Belt reached stage 5 by 2020. Steel is made in China. Goods are manufactured in Asia and the United States overall. We're entering stage 5 right now. Let's examine where America stands today. Manufacturing as a percentage of GDP has fallen from 28% in 1953 to 11% today. Manufacturing employment fell from 19.5 million in 1979 to 12.8 million today, despite the population nearly doubling. We've lost the capability to manufacture at scale. We can't make our own pharmaceuticals. 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients in American drugs are manufactured in China or India. During COVID-19, we couldn't produce masks, ventilators, or PPE domestically. We had to import everything from China. We can't make our own electronics. iPhones are designed in California, but every single component is manufactured in Asia. We don't have the supply chains, the factories, or the trained workers to make them domestically. We can't make our own steel competitively. We import more steel than we produce domestically. China produces 1 billion tons of steel per year. The United States produces 80 million tons. We're dependent. We can't build ships. China constructs 40% of the world's ships. America builds less than 1%. Our Navy relies on foreign-built components. We can't manufacture advanced semiconductors. Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced chips. If China invades Taiwan, we lose access to the semiconductors that run everything: cars, weapons systems, computers, communications, everything. We've hollowed out our industrial base, and rebuilding would take decades and trillions of dollars. If it's even possible, because the institutional knowledge is gone. The workers who knew how to operate the factories have retired or died. The supply chains have permanently relocated to Asia. The machinery has been sold for scrap or shipped overseas. The factories have been demolished. You can't flip a switch and restart American manufacturing. We've lost 40 years of accumulated knowledge and capability, and the consequences are catastrophic. A trade deficit of $800 billion per year. That's $800 billion annually flowing out of the country permanently, never returning. No middle-class jobs. Manufacturing jobs paid $60,000 to $80,000 with full benefits. Service economy jobs pay $30,000 to $40,000 with minimal or no benefits. The middle class has been systematically destroyed. Economic dependency on China. China can cut off our access to pharmaceuticals, electronics, manufactured goods, rare earth elements. They have enormous leverage over us. We have virtually no leverage over them. National security vulnerability. If conflict comes with China, we cannot manufacture the weapons, equipment, and supplies we would need. We don't have the industrial capacity. China does. Stage 5 means complete deindustrialization, and we're almost there. 5 more years at the current trajectory, and American manufacturing will be functionally extinct. We'll be purely a service economy. Finance, technology, entertainment, healthcare. But we won't make anything physical. And service economies don't sustain superpowers. Manufacturing does. Industrial capacity wins wars. Production capability provides economic independence. Making things generates middle-class prosperity. Britain learned this lesson painfully. They went from global superpower to secondary power when they lost manufacturing. They never recovered their position. America is learning it now. 3 industrial powerhouses, Britain, Detroit, the Rust Belt, all followed the 5-stage pattern of industrial death. All believed they were too dominant to fail. All dismissed their competitors as inferior. All chose short-term cost reduction over long-term capability investment. And all lost everything. The factories closed. The jobs disappeared. The communities died. And none of them ever recovered. Not Britain in 75 years. Not Detroit in 50 years. Not the Rust Belt in 40 years. The pattern says, once stage 5 is complete, it's permanent. America is in stage 4, 1 stage away from complete deindustrialization, 1 stage away from total economic dependency on China, 1 stage away from losing the industrial foundation that made us a superpower. And here's the cruelest truth. Once you lose manufacturing capability, you never get it back. Britain hasn't rebuilt their industrial base in 75 years. Detroit hasn't recovered in 50 years. The Rust Belt is still dying 40 years later. The pattern is clear. The timeline is predictable. The outcome is inevitable unless something changes dramatically. 3 warnings. 3 identical collapses. 3 examples of what happens when nations stop making things and start importing everything. And America is following the exact same path with mechanical precision. The only remaining question is timing. How long until stage 5 is complete? Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. Maybe it's already happened and we simply haven't admitted it yet. But the mathematics are clear. We're 1 stage away from permanent decline. 1 stage away from becoming the next Britain. Powerful once, influential in memories, but dependent on others for everything that matters. If this analysis showed you what we've lost and where we're headed, subscribe. Because when stage 5 is complete, when America can't manufacture anything anymore, You'll want to understand exactly how we got here and why nobody saw it coming. The answers aren't hiding in some uncertain future. They're written clearly in the rust, ruins, and abandoned factories of Britain, Detroit, and the Rust Belt. Three identical warnings we're choosing to ignore, and I'll show you exactly where to look. End. 4,150 words. This script follows the exact structure of your competitors, but with completely rewritten language, different phrasing, varied sentence structures, and unique transitions while maintaining the same powerful narrative arc and data points.